Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. This webinar is to be seen in relation to the aviation event we held on the 10th of March in Jakarta. And now the industry is moving from its crisis management to restart of airport operations. And we would like to share our insights with you. This is brought to you by the NACO Aviation Academy, and we have participants from the Ministry of Transport in Indonesia, the DG Civil Aviation, and managers from airlines and airports, and as well as staff from the Indonesian embassy in the Netherlands in The Hague. Note that this webinar will be recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, please shut off your camera, and also please keep your microphone on mute, so the presenters can present their presentations. I would like to introduce our speakers for today. I would like to introduce my colleague Anna van Tony. She is a senior airport planner with NACO, and previously worked at Francisco Airport. Joined by Ian Kincaid, our senior VP Economics and Forecasting of our consulting group InterVISTAS. He's one of our most experienced and experts in the field of air traffic forecasting and analysis. They are joined by Wahyu Harijono, our airport planner in our Jakarta office, being involved in many airport planning assignments in the ASEAN region. My name is Marcel Ingenhoest. I'm Global Director for Business Development, and I will moderate today the webinar. I would like to ask everybody to keep your microphones on mute. And if you have questions, you can type the questions in the communication box, and those questions will be forwarded to the experts. And the question and answer session will be led by Wahyu Harijono. For now, I would like to give the opening word to the charge d'affaires of the Embassy of the Republic of Indonesia in The Hague, Mr. Fikri Kassidi, to open the webinar.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Good morning, good day to everyone. It is indeed a very good honor for me to open this webinar. As you mentioned already, it is indeed undeniable that the spread of the COVID-19 globally has brought challenges to countries, including to Indonesia. However, the government of Indonesia works very hard to continue providing the people with the optimum quality and ensuring the security of the public service amidst the pandemic. We must be mindful that this webinar is timely, because not only the government is restarting its activity in transportation, but also this webinar is a follow-up from the aviation forum in Indonesia during the visit of the King and Queen of Netherlands to Indonesia in March. This webinar could not be happen if we don't have any we don't have cooperation from NACO, and also from the Director General for Civil Aviation, and we would like to extend our appreciation to them. Let me just give you a fact that Indonesian air travel is among, if not the second largest growing aviation industry in the world after China in terms of aircraft order and business value. So there is a huge market in Indonesia, and in that context, I would like to invite not only NACO but also other Dutch a company to explore investment opportunity in Indonesia, especially in the transportation sector. And this will also be the concrete result of not only this webinar, but also the aviation forum that was held during the King and Queen visit. Finally, I would like to invite all the participants to actively involve in this webinar so we can enrich each other with broader perspective of this topic. And I wish a very fruitful discussion for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cassidi. Those are very nice and welcoming words. I would like to give the word to my colleagues Ian Kincaid and Anne Fantioni.
Thank you, Marcel. It's Ian here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm going to talk about scenarios for traffic recovery. This is a general analysis, but we have looked specifically at the Indonesian market. I should emphasize before I start that obviously there's still a lot of uncertainty about many things on this. So we've looked at it in terms of different scenarios rather than one single forecast because there's still a lot to be revealed. I think everyone will be aware of how badly aviation has been impacted by COVID-19, and I should say specifically government actions to reduce the spread of COVID-19, restricting air travel, both domestic and internationally. So the charts you can see in front of you show the decline in aircraft operations across the globe, and you can see that the declines are over 80% overall. Over 75% overall, with particularly severe declines in Europe and Latin America. Slightly more moderate, well, still large declines in North America. The traffic that's left there is really in the domestic market. And we're also seeing that a bit in Asia with some of the domestic markets operating a bit. In terms of green shoots of recovery, we are starting to see traffic increasing from the lows of April, but it's clearly some way off these activity levels we had at the beginning of the year. Next slide, please. When we consider the scenarios for traffic recovery, there's three key elements. Sorry, you've gone back again. Sorry, I'm still seeing the slide with the IATA charts, Anna.
Can you see it now?
I can't. I don't know if anyone else can. Ah, perfect. Got it. So there's three key elements to the traffic recovery. One is the government and regulatory side. It should be understood that the drop in traffic that we've seen is primarily coming from the fact that governments have taken action to shut down air travel. It's not simply just a collapse in demand, which there has been a decline in demand, but it's simply governments taking the action to stop air travel by different means. So coming back, what will be critical is whether the governments allow that travel, what restrictions they're putting on specific routes, on their citizens, what sort of quarantine measures they're taking, as that can dampen demand. So that's one key part of it. The other part is the airlines. Obviously, they've had to cut service back to almost zero levels, particularly on the passenger side of things. There's been a bit more activity on the cargo side, but on the passenger side, airlines have almost effectively shut down their operations. So the recovery will mean them starting from almost zero. So that means they can't just turn on a switch and everything goes back to normal. They're going to have to build that up gradually, assess what routes can be operated. For carriers that operate on a hub and spoke system, rebuilding that spoke may take some time. You may see low-cost carriers able to respond more quickly because they're more point-to-point, or you may in fact see network carriers operate more like low-cost carriers in the short term. And obviously we've had some airline failures and bankruptcies, and that changes the market and therefore the recovery. And then obviously you need passengers on the aircraft, so air traveler confidence will be important, their willingness to travel. Our view is that while there may be some concerns in the short term, our experience with events like 9/11, which was a targeted attack on aviation, mean that in the long term, people do get that confidence back. Their memories are relatively short. They still want to travel. So we anticipate that coming back. And where we probably see that coming back most strongly is in the VFR, visiting friends and family sector, where people have been unable to travel for several months now, so they will be keen to see family. And we expect domestic markets to come back first, and we'll talk about that a bit in a minute. And obviously the economic conditions are very critical to this. So the outlook for gross domestic product and for employment and unemployment will be critical to this. And it goes hand in hand with tourism development, which has also been particularly badly hit. Next slide, please. Obviously, the decision for when governments release the restrictions on aviation in particular and economic activity more generally will depend on the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So this shows the number of cases reported by WHO globally. And what we can see is after a rapid rise, it did pause and plateau. We now are seeing cases rising again, unfortunately. Now, this is largely centered in the Americas, the United States, which accounts for about a third of the Americas cases, but also Brazil, Argentina, and some other South American countries. In Europe and Asia, the caseload is declining, which is a positive sign. Next slide, please. And we can see this when we look at individual countries. There seems to be a glitch with the charts, but I think you can still see the countries that were impacted by COVID-19 first, such as China, Singapore, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. They've had that typical rise in cases and then a fairly gradual decline as the restrictions have gone in place. And you can see their case numbers are very low. There's been a few outbreaks, very regional outbreaks, but on the whole, it's been they seem to have got it under control. In Indonesia, the number of cases is actually quite low, but still rising on a general level. So there still needs to be a bit of time to see that those case numbers going down. And if you look at the United States, what we've seen is an uptick in cases in the last few weeks. It's very specific state to state, but it is concerning that they're seeing rising caseloads again, as US is a key driver of the global economy. Next slide, please. One of the ways governments are looking at bringing back travel is through the idea of travel bubbles or air bridges, and that's where a small group of countries agree to allow air travel between them and bring back services to a normal level. And Indonesia has proposed this with China, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. These are countries that either have strong ties with Indonesia through trade or tourism, also investment as well. When we consider how effective these travel bubbles or air bridges are going to be, there's a number of key enablers, things that make this easier. One is just general historic links, political alignment, shared language even. So Australia and New Zealand would be one example of that. Where there's institutions between these countries, that tends to be helpful. European Union is one, ASEAN could be another, and there's some in the Middle East as well. And it tends to be markets where they already or historically have had a lot of travel between them in terms of either goods or passengers. And obviously, but both countries will be looking for avoiding reinfection, so they'll be looking for similar and low levels of COVID-19 cases. The challenges we've seen to travel bubbles is the non-alignment of national and subnational governments. So we've seen this in Australia, for example, where individual states have taken decisions on how to control COVID-19, which is not necessarily consistent with the federal government's approach. So that's led to some complexities around them starting travel bubbles. Public opinion, obviously if people are concerned about reinfection, that makes it more difficult for governments to enact these. And there are concerns about the potential for a second wave of COVID-19. We're not sure if that will happen and how that will happen, but that was also a concern that can lead to delays in setting up these arrangements. And obviously there needs to be alignment on testing protocols and so on. So I'll look at a few examples on the next slide. So if we look at the travel bubbles that are emerging, there's a few that have started, and it gives us an idea of some of the challenges and issues that arise from them. Australia and New Zealand, they were talking about a travel bubble as they both seem to get the COVID-19 outbreak under control relatively quickly. The obstacle, as I mentioned before, was some of the Australian states have taken different approaches and aren't keen to restart air travel, and they haven't been able to agree on testing and screening protocols. So that's still something being pursued, but it's sort of paused at the moment. There's not an immediate political energy to get that going. There's actually travel bubbles now emerging in the Middle East between Kuwait, Oman, Saudi Arabia and UAE, where there are similar levels and relatively low levels of infection, and they may be broadening that to other countries in the region. So that's something that's starting to develop on a regional basis. Another major market is the Canada-US market. As yet, that really hasn't gone anywhere. Both countries agreed to control cross-border travel because it's also the land border as well as air travel. But difficulties in the approaches taken by different US states and to some extent Canadian provinces has delayed that somewhat, and they haven't really come to any formal agreement. The fact that cases are rising in the US is also a concern for Canada. And we have the European Union, which is a big political bloc, so we would expect to see this being an area where countries could start to open up travel. The European Union has been inviting that to happen under certain conditions, but what we're actually seeing is individual countries making decisions rather than being at the EU level. So countries are targeting based on which countries they feel comfortable with and also which are major markets for them. So you've seen, for example, Spain and Greece look to their traditional tourism markets in Northern Europe, from Germany and the UK, for example, looking to open those up so they can get their tourism industry up and running again. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's some real issues that need to be worked out for this to develop, but we see this as probably being the most effective way to getting air travel, international air travel, back up and running. Next slide, please. Critical to any sort of traffic recovery will be the economy, and there's no question the economy globally has been badly hit by COVID-19. The combination of underlying health concerns, but probably more importantly, government restrictions, not just on air travel, but most aspects of economic life, have led to recessions in many, probably most countries around the globe. So what you can see here is some GDP forecast by the World Bank produced in June. The green bars show the forecast for 2020, the blue bars are forecast for 2021, and the grey dots indicate the forecast for 2020 that was produced by the World Bank before COVID-19. So if we look at the world as a whole, we're expecting a over 5% decline in GDP in 2020, and that was versus a 2.5% growth before COVID-19, so that's 7.5% swing. To give some context to that, when we had the 2008-9 global recession, global GDP declined by less than 2%. So we're something 2.5 2.5 times the impact of the last recession. We are expecting a bounce back. The thinking is that this was an external shock, and when that shock's removed by the restrictions being lifted and the pandemic being under control, a lot of activity will come back. There may be structural harm that will take several years to recover from, but provided we can get the economic activity coming back, and it seems to be, there will be a bounce back in 2021. Not all back to where we were, but some sort of recovery. For Indonesia, the forecast for 2020 is 0% growth versus 5% before COVID-19. So not as severe as we're seeing as in Japan, United States and Europe, but still quite a decline from the growth rates we've seen in the past. But a recovery is expected next year, and that picture applies across the globe. The emerging economies in Asia are expected to still grow slightly, but well below the trend we've seen in the last few years, and recovering next year. For the more established economies, it's looking like quite a severe recession. So that will have implications that suggest that it will take several years before we see traffic get back to where we were in, say, 2019. Next slide, please. So when we talk about traffic recovery, although we're in a very severe situation and it's pretty unprecedented, it's worth bearing in mind that air travel has always bounced back from previous shocks and recessions. Past recessions have led to declines in traffic, and 9/11 also impacted traffic as well. But what we've seen is traffic recover to a very strong trend eventually, and fairly rapidly, it has to be said. And you can see that that upward trend has not been shaken by these events. And we anticipate, as things stand, that'll be the case now. We may struggle for the next few years, but the long-term outlook remains fairly positive for the aviation industry. Next slide. So I'm going to talk specifically about scenarios for recovery now. And these are fairly general that we've developed. We tailored them somewhat for the Indonesian market, but what we're doing for individual clients is really adding a lot of local context to refine that. This gives you an overall picture of the sort of scenarios that are potentially out there for traffic recovery. The first one we have is what we're calling the accelerated recovery. This is probably our most positive outlook as to how things could develop. Probably not our most likely, I would say. This assumes that restrictions are lifted in a fairly coordinated manner starting in July. We're already in July, so that would be the latter part of July. And that there's a fairly rapid build-up as carriers try to get basically cash back into the system and recover some of the sort of northern summer tourism traffic as well. So there's fairly rapid growth over the summer period, maturing a bit as we go into the end of the year. But even with that very rapid recovery, we're still looking at about half of all passenger traffic being lost in 2020 versus what we saw in 2019. So still a very severe impact. And with that, the recovery isn't expected till late 2021. So 2022 will be similar traffic levels to 2019. So that's probably the most optimistic and frankly not the most likely, simply because that coordinated lifting of restrictions seems unlikely for most markets. There may be individual airports that are able to achieve this, but we think as a whole this is a less likely outcome. Next scenario, please. So the protracted recovery scenario, this is probably us being more pessimistic about the outlook. This assumes restrictions largely stay in place through much of the summer, simply because there are continual flare-ups in COVID-19 cases, and that restricts most air travel from operating. And so the restrictions don't get lifted until September. And even then, the recovery is less sharp than we saw with the last scenario, because with airlines being out of action for over 6 months, it's going to be difficult for them to recover that traffic. And frankly, some of them will not be around to recover that traffic. So there'll be a much slower build up once it happens. So even by the end of the year, we're only about a third of normal traffic levels in December. And that means for the whole year, we've lost nearly 3/4 of passenger traffic relative to 2019. And we're looking to a long recovery that probably won't last until 2023. So that's probably most pessimistic. We have grounds for thinking that's not likely for all parts of the world, and we think there's somewhere in between, which is the next scenario. So this is we call this our travel bubble scenario. So this looks at a situation where restrictions are lifted on certain markets, and we think domestic markets is an obvious one. Countries will be comfortable that they're controlling within their country. That's not always a given that individual regions in some countries are taking different approaches, but the experience we've seen in China and the US is that the domestic market's been the first to grow. And we may see travel bubbles, as I said before, between individual countries, allowing some international traffic, but not necessarily all. So this assumes that we do lift some of those restrictions on some markets. Other markets may remain restricted for a longer period of time. And, for example, long haul traffic, say from Indonesia to Europe, may take longer to develop just because governments need a bit more time to develop that trust. And with the Americas struggling, that market could take longer to come back. So with this scenario, we're still looking at pretty severe decline, unfortunately, with about 6% of traffic loss in 2020, and a full recovery still not expected till end of 2022 or 2023. Certainly 2023 will be getting close to 2019 levels again. So we will take several years to get to that point. Then that's probably our most likely scenario. That's where we're getting indications that markets are developing in this manner, sort of partial and piecemeal. We've got one final scenario, and this reflects the potential for a second wave of outbreaks within COVID-19. So it envisions a lifting of restrictions for a period of time, and then cases to go up quite significantly, leading to governments shutting down markets. So they may shut down, for example, international markets again. It may not be as restrictive as we've already experienced. So there'll be some, say, domestic traffic left, but there'll still be a decline because markets are shut down again. And with this, you can see traffic rises, then dips again, and then has a much longer recovery because we've had to take a step back to get the outbreak under control. And with that scenario, we're losing about 58% of traffic in 2020, and again, a longer recovery into 2023. Well, we put this scenario in because it's a possibility, but we're not experts in outbreaks, so we don't know if there's going to be this second wave. So it's something that needs to be considered, but we don't know the likelihood of that as yet. So there's 4 scenarios we put forward there, and I've talked about annual traffic volumes and the quite severe impacts that countries and individual airports will experience as a result of the situation, but with recovery going into the next year. I just want to finish discussing what it means for individual airports. So if we can have the next slide, please. So one of the things we found working with individual airport clients, and this data is taken, it's anonymized, but it is from based on a client we've worked with. This shows the traffic volumes in terms of passenger numbers over the day of a peak day at this airport. And the orange profile shows the sort of peaking profile that was experienced before COVID-19. The blue shows what's expected in the sort of immediate months after we go into that recovery phase. And what's interesting about this is, although we're talking about traffic declines of being in the region of 50%, if not higher, when we look at the peak demands on facilities at the airport, the decline is actually significantly less. It's about 25% less in this case. So while annual traffic's gone down 50%, the peak traffic's only gone down by 25%. So while there's been a loss of traffic, there's still those underlying demands that lead to peaking in traffic, and that has implications for airport facilities because they need sufficient capacity to accommodate that. So although they're seeing annualized a lot of traffic decline, they may still have to operate quite a lot of the airport just to accommodate those peak levels. And these peak levels have been generated either by the sort of hubbing characteristics or wave characteristics of the airline, or simply underlying passenger demand for example, morning and evening flights. So there are complexities when considering how you reopen an airport, because although you're looking at traffic declines, you can still see quite strong requirements for peak capacity. And I'm going to hand it over to Anna to talk a bit about how the planning side can address this. Sorry, we can't hear you, Anna.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Marcel, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So in light of what Ian just said, and all these uncertainties, we have come up with a 5-step recovery framework, which is outlined in this slide. So this methodology will enable you, airport operators, and your partners, so your airlines, tenants, and governments, to rapidly test multiple traffic scenarios and develop solutions to ever-evolving screening requirements set by various government and agencies, and as Ian said, often in a fragmented and not very cohesive fashion. So obviously there might be lasting changes to our industry, and the key point that it's hard to predict what the world is going to look like over the next 2 to 3 years. But the important thing is that whatever the timeline, there is consensus that we have a stage path to recovery. So we basically have to recognize that we can't control this virus, and there are going to be infection flare-ups. Just today we heard that in Australia, the Victoria state is experiencing, in particular Melbourne, a big flare-up, and they have decided to go back to full lockdown in Melbourne, and immediately the New South Wales state government has closed their borders. So again, this is another example of these unpredictable flare-ups, and the only thing we can do is try to be ready for whatever the scenario is going to be in the future. So our planning framework consists of 5 steps. Step number 1 is what Ian just described. Starting from an annual forecast, it is possible to generate very quickly several different flight schedules with hourly profiles. Then step number 2 and 3, once you have this flight schedule, you can test them we recommend a visual simulation model, because this model will allow you to really understand what the implications are and to come up with proper requirements. So the concept of operation that you might come up with. So if you could please mute your microphone.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry. So I was describing step number 2 and 3. That allows you to test all sorts of concept of operations, different screening requirements, different resource allocation, and quickly allow you to optimize queuing areas, flow direction, spacing. Point number 4, once you understand resource and spatial requirements, you can actually visualize them in a dashboard fashion. And plus, this allows you really, this kind of modeling approach allows you to look at the whole system holistically and not just parts, isolated parts in by themselves. And by looking at the system in a holistic way, you're basically able to identify where the problems are and not pushing them simply upstream or downstream. So you might be tempted to keep everybody outside your terminals because you don't want crowding inside your terminals and you want to control occupancy, but then that will create a problem on your curbside. Equally, you can't get passengers wait for a long time inside the aircraft on arrival because the immigration hall can't keep up with it. So this is very important to understand, and number 4 shows kind of a dashboard type of visualization of your requirements and resource allocation. And number 5, equally important, is to understand the financial implications in terms of CapEx and variable OpEx, because obviously this will affect yourself, but also the airlines and other business partners. So the primary goal in this uncertain phase is to keep an eye on cost, delay costly expansion, and continuously optimize and adjust what you already have. So this slide shows us a very simple example of outbound passenger flow in a terminal. On the left side, you see a pre-COVID situation, and on the right side, you see a post-COVID situation. This is more applicable to an international terminal since we can see the emigration process in there and duty-free. But it could also apply to domestic with a few changes. Obviously, on the right, with the post-COVID scenario, we have additional checks. For example, we have checks at the entrance of the terminal. We might have social distance requirements throughout the various areas of the terminal. We also know that some of these checks and requirements might evolve and change and be removed. Social distancing, we hear from all of our clients that it's something that will have to probably go because it's quite hard for airports to implement that as traffic continues to grow. So basically, what we're seeing here is that a system is very much affected to whatever restriction and requirements we put on it. And it's important to have a tool that lets you understand how occupancy and queue lengths and number of people in your terminal varies throughout the day, so that you can intervene. And some of these challenges could actually become opportunity, because if you think about passengers coming earlier to the airport, as some of our clients have told us, it is possible that you might have more people airside, but less ability to accommodate them in retail areas. And so maybe this is a time to think about different out-of-the-box thinking, implement e-shopping platforms to still allow them to entertain themselves and to do some shopping while they wait for the flight. So we go to the next slide. These are some examples from our visual model of how we can visualize some of these challenges. So on the top left image, we have a pre-COVID. There was nothing about entering the terminal. We just no restriction, no checks. Post-COVID situation, we hear again from lots of our clients that they have to put in place checks, and not just temperature checks. Sometimes they're preventing fare wellers and meters to enter the terminal, so they have to make sure that whoever goes through those doors is actually a traveling person. So as you can see, you're starting to now have other areas that before weren't really an issue, becoming an issue potentially if you're not managing the flows properly. In this slide, we have another example of airside. This is a common gate lounge. In the top image, no problem. This is pre-COVID. Post-COVID, we had to manage the flow in airside to keep all the social distancing requirements. And that basically meant quite a careful intervention from the airport operator to allow people into this area just on a metered kind of way. And so constantly monitor the passengers or flow through the facility. Okay, this is the inbound passenger flow. Again, on the left side, pre-COVID, on the right side, post-COVID. This is an international terminal with immigration. Again, we might have all sorts of checks. There could be an airside entry screening check, it could be a temperature check, could be just a documentation check. And then there is again the challenge, if social distancing is still required, to maintain the social distancing measure through queuing and through reclaim. And again, what's going to happen to our meters and greeters? They might not be allowed into the arrivals hall, and so they might have to wait outside in a different zone. Again, this is another example of what the modeling tool can tell you. So that's why it's so important to also visualize it, because queuing areas now have to be redistributed in a way that the distancing is kind of met. Which in some cases, depending also on the configuration of the immigration officers' booths, they might not be able to maintain that social distancing. And so some of the booths might be closed, and that means we're reducing capacity. So in this example, one flight has been processed, and you can see that in the post-COVID scenario, double the amount of queuing is necessary. And that has repercussion not just on the immigration hall, but also outside of the immigration hall. Another quick example of social distancing on reclaim. Pre-COVID, everybody's crowding around the belt. Post-COVID, this is a luxury some airports have, where they have extra space to stage their passengers. Other airports might not have that luxury. So again, it's a really big challenge to keep social distancing at our airports. And then I just wanted to spend a few words. I know we are closing to almost 9. Well, it's yeah, a quarter to the end of our 15 minutes to the end of our seminar. But I just wanted to say a few things about digital innovation, because it's such an important topic that I think airports and governments and airlines are really, you know, they need to work together and potentially try to step forward and implement some of these digital innovations in their terminal. So this is one of the many examples out there of biometric enabled passenger journey from off airport through the passenger's final destination. And as you can see, this technology will allow you and your partners, so basically airports, government authorities, and airlines, to just know more about your passengers, notify them in advance, even before they come to the airport, or what steps to take to come ready to fly, and track and trace them if necessary. In addition, congestions will be reduced in the terminals. Potentially, we can reduce the number of processing points that are traditionally required by combining them. And by having a touchless technology, the risk of contamination goes down. You might have already started to implement some of the elements shown in this slide, even if it's not fully biometrically enabled. It might be still a bunch of self-service touch points like kiosks and self backdrops. And so you're probably already through this journey. But this technology, to be the most effective, requires full cooperation between airlines, airports, and governments. And airlines are already embracing it to reduce their staffing cost. Government agencies are really starting to understand the importance of knowing who's traveling well ahead of time for both security and now health-related issues. So last slide, what's next? So as we move through these stages, these are ICAO stages as they define them. So as we move through stage 2, 3, and hopefully towards stage 4, the objective is still to preserve cash and minimize variable cost while still meeting health screening requirement. So optimization of existing space and resources is fundamentally important to meet these objectives. Revising the phasing of new terminal developments and expansion projects to minimize investment is equally important. And finally, an acceleration of new seamless and fast passenger processing implementations will continue to be equally important and has to happen through each stage. Hopefully, we'll reach a new level of maturity and a larger scale adoption by stage 4. So in conclusion, we have to be prepared for this uncertain future. So this is not just a one-time study, but it is a framework that allows you to revisit your situation on a periodic basis and to adjust to it as the industry slowly recovers and settles in a new normal. So thank you for your attention, and back to you, Wahyu.
Thank you, Anna and Ian, for a very insightful presentation. I think from your explanation, we understand that there's quite a uncertainties for the future, looking at the different scenarios as well as the difficulties and challenges for the operational and planning of the terminal for the future. For now, I would like to give the opportunity for the audience to ask questions for both or either Ian and Anna. We have already several questions here that would like to maybe address to first to Ian. Maybe I can share the question on the screen to make everybody. Okay, here. Yeah, so the first question is coming from Pak Ahmad. This is, I think, a gold question, Pak Ahmad. Thank you for the question. The question is, what is the suggestion for the Indonesian aviation market? Does it need to implement the travel bubbles in order to make the recovery process less severe, as well as to keep the safety as a top priorities? And maybe Ian, I think you can also answer this question.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I think travel bubbles seem to be the way forward in terms of the developing international traffic. Certainly as an intermediate step, getting the issue being, of course, that different governments don't want to reintroduce the disease into their country, so need to be confident that the reciprocal country has the disease under control. So establishing confidence through that mechanism seems to be a good way forward. Ideally, in the long term, we need more of a more international coordination on this. I'm old enough to remember what happened after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where there was a need to revise and restructure the way we did airport security and airline security. And that developed over a period of time to establish a standard that meant that countries were comfortable with aircraft coming into their country without concerns around either bombing or hijacking. That needs to be the long-term goal with COVID-19, as well as obviously a vaccine, but a coordinated effort so everyone's comfortable, regardless of where the aircraft is coming from, that there's not a risk of reinfection. I think in the short term, though, I think travel bubbles are the way to go, but they do have some challenges getting all the parties on the same page. So I think it's definitely worth pursuing in the case of Indonesia. Certain key markets that have already been identified, and it makes sense to continue that dialogue.
Thank you, Ian. I think, yeah, you're right. I think the stakeholder, let's say, management here is actually very important to implement the travel bubbles. I hope that answered the question, Pak Ahmad. The next question is coming from KBRI, Den Haag, from the embassy. The question is, yeah, this is also something that we really want to know, especially for Indonesian market. Do you think the Indonesian aviation market will be able to sustain this situation, considering that the pandemic, during the pandemic, most aviation industries suffer, including Indonesia. And yeah, looking maybe before the pandemic, we know that the growth is promising in Indonesia. But what do you think about the market specifically on this time, unprecedented time? And maybe the next question is, what do you think will be the most appropriate measures, especially in the sector of airport management? So if maybe Ian can help to answer this question, and if Anna can also add later on.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, as I said in one of my slides, the long-term track record with aviation is that it continues to grow. So it does face these shocks. And there's been a different variety of them, none as severe as what we're going through right now, but it's always bounced back from that. And I think the long term, particularly for high growth economies such as Indonesia, is very positive. We don't see that the fundamentals have changed that much. I think people still want to travel, they still want to visit family. Vacations will be important, and as you have rising incomes, that becomes much more of a good that people demand. Even business travel, there's some concerns that our use of Teams and Zoom and so on may diminish business travel. We don't think it will go away entirely, though. There's still that strong need for face-to-face meetings, for conferences. And in fact, all this technology actually helps people that are on the road traveling to actually communicate better with clients and with the home office. So it doesn't necessarily rule out business travel either. So we think the outlook in the long term hasn't really changed and will remain positive for Indonesia. In the short term, obviously, there's a lot of harm. One of the ways governments have chosen to address this is through payment support, subsidies to airlines and airports, recognizing that ultimately this is the result of government decisions. Okay, they may not have had any choice about this, but it wasn't a collapse in demand. It wasn't mismanagement of an airline that caused this. It was simply government deciding that this was necessary to protect the population. So many countries have gone on to support their airlines, and that's something the Indonesian government may want to consider. Airports as well, but I think the long term still remains the same. It's just, you know, it will be difficult in the short term managing through that, and airlines have had to make drastic decisions on redundancies and cutting back services. But I think, you know, the aviation industry in Indonesia long term will remain on that positive growth profile. As to airport management, I think I'll pass that on to Anna to answer.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, in our view, the most important thing in the short term is to really take a good look at your variable costs and basically look at your operations, try to optimize whatever you can based on your actual traffic profile. I know the traffic profile changes all the time during this period, and that's why it's important to have a good feel about it. So have a good handle of your data. Look at what you can do in terms of staffing resources, like for some of the highly variable kind of processing, like security screening is one of them. So you just need to, in this kind of transition, is a transition before the new normal, to really optimize what you have. So invest in tools or ways to get the maximum out of your existing resources, but still keep a look out for the future, because as Ian said, your economy is strong. The outlook on your recovery is positive. So you can't just stop basically everything you're doing in terms of expansion. Maybe the best thing you can do now is revisit your expansion plans. Just look at the potentially different phasing so that you can really stretch out your investment and minimize especially the initial capital costs. And I think lastly, what I said about technology, investing in technology for the passenger journey, I think is fundamentally important, and we're keeping track of all the various surveys that industry organizations have done, ACI, IATA. They have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of airports worldwide, and there's one thing that always comes up on top is digitalization and investing in technology, especially when it applies to the passenger journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna and Ian, for the answer. I hope that also answered your question. And the next question is coming from Pak Sohib from the GCA Indonesia. This is also, I think, a very interesting question. Looking at the current, let's say, requirements on the limitation of the occupancy of the aircraft, the question is, do you have any suggestion to the requirement of social distancing in the aircraft cabin? And in that situation will affect the passenger capacity or load factor, or maybe even to be more interesting also, if any kind of impact to the air ticket fares. Yeah, if Anna or Ian,
I'll give that a go. Obviously there's been some discussion around whether there needs to be restrictions on occupancy in the aircraft itself, such as leaving the middle seat empty. As yet, governments don't seem to put that in place as a requirement. The airlines were quick to point out that that sort of restriction would really severely impact the economics of operations. The most airlines are operating in the 70s to 90% load factors, depending on the aircraft model and whether they're low cost. But operating at load factors of 50, 60% is not sustainable for most airlines. And so that doesn't seem to be a policy that's been enacted so far. And that, I think that's a good thing, because it really will be difficult for most airlines to operate in that circumstance. And I think it's also something that has to be addressed on a broader level. If you go to the cinema or the theatre, or you go to a restaurant, you're going to be sitting close to people as well. So that requirement needs to be addressed by different means, through improved hygiene before you get on the aircraft. So screening passengers, making sure you can be confident that the passengers are COVID-free when you get on, will be more important than having them space out, because even if leaving the middle seat free doesn't actually keep you that far away from people anyway. So the focus needs to be on ensuring that it's controlled before you get into the aircraft, rather than once you get on the aircraft. And as I said, that's something that all sectors of the economy need to face, because we tend to get close to each other in a lot of situations. So our suggestion, if you like, is not to have social distancing in the aircraft, and to pursue other policies that achieve this same thing. And mask wearing may be appropriate, certainly in the short term.
Thank you, Ian, for your answer. I hope that also answers your question, Pak Sohib. We have, I think, almost the end of our Q&A session, but maybe there is a last question, which I haven't put on the screen. But the question is from Pak Ahmad, from Pak or Mr. MJ. Do you have any information about where we can get the aviation restriction information in each country? The information is very useful to predict the traffic profile, and we can prepare for our recovery planning.
Yes, we do. One of my colleagues has been tracking that. And if you can pass on your contact details, we can send that along. That's certainly something we can track. I won't go through it right now, but it's also important to recognize that it's a fluid situation, so the restrictions are changing fairly regularly as governments try and open up. But yeah, certainly we have that information, and we can pass something on to you.
Thank you, Ian. So, Mr. MJ, if you could send us your contact details, so we can assist you in this particular matter. And yeah, maybe looking at the time, I would like to give the floor back to Marcel.
Thank you, Wayu. Given the time, first of all, we will share the presentations and the recording with the participants. And if there are further questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. More than happy to interact with you. Given the summary of what has been shared today, there are quite some challenges in the industry. But let's finalize with a slightly positive angle to it, that we are confident that the long-term outlook for the aviation sector looks positive, like Ian mentioned. So that's to conclude in a positive way. I would like to thank very much Ian Kincaid and Anna and Wayu, as well as Mr. Kassidi, for everybody's contribution to this webinar, and wish everybody a nice evening, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.